Thank you very much. And it certainly has been a pleasure, an absolute joy to sit through all the presentations this morning. So I want to thank the organizers, Dr. Miller, and all of the panelists. The work that you're doing is just so important. The perspective that I'm going to share is somewhat of a practitioner's perspective, someone that has devoted their entire career to addressing and trying to mitigate the effects of the negative consequences, if you will, of exposure to the social dislocations and the inequities that we talked about this morning. In particular, when the social determinants of health framework first began to gain some traction, what was frustrating me in this country was the absence of an explicit inclusion of the issue of racism in that framework. Now, we've pushed that envelope a bit. In some parts of the world, particularly in Brazil, they are very explicit about racism as a social determinant of health. And there's some folks at the CDC that have pushed to get it into our broader contextual understanding. But I think it's critically important if we allow that piece of it to remain invisible and not directly and explicitly addressed, I don't think we'll make the progress that has to be made on behalf of most of the children in this country. And the Kellogg Foundation was created well over 80 years ago, and our founder was quite generous. He said, do what you will with the money so long as it helps vulnerable children. So over time, we've done a lot of different things. Amazing partnerships with universities. We've actually built fields. The participatory research model, which is now more often referred to as community engagement. The community college system, Kellogg did a lot to invest and create that work. And we have been a leader in funding racial equity work for well over 30 years. It's only been in the last decade that we really honed in on racial healing and racial equity. And I've been privileged to be able to design and lead that work. Over the last decade, we've invested well over $200 million in the field, largely in community-based organizations, but also we have funded some research that's relevant. And so what I want to do today is share with you sort of the trajectory of that work, primarily to inspire your imaginations to see the intersection between the work that you're doing and the work that's being done by literally hundreds of thousands of people all over this country. But in order to be more effective, you know, there's an African proverb that says to stumble is not to fall, but to move forward faster. In order for them to move forward faster, they need the science that you are producing. They need the research to back up the urgency and the commitment that they are bringing to this work. Now, I know I'm not in Washington, D.C., which is where I live these days, although our foundation is based in Battle Creek, Michigan, but I'm lucky enough to be able to work from the D.C. area, and that could be viewed in many ways. But I know that I'm not there because I heard the word regulation used at least 12 times here this morning, and it was always positive, you know, and I had a moment of cognitive dissonance, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm not, I'm not in D.C. The other way I know I'm not in D.C., I put my St. John's dark blue suit in the suitcase this morning, and I said, I'm in California. I can relax a little bit. So we'll walk through these slides. I do bring you greetings on behalf of the president of our foundation, LeJune Montgomery Tabron, and our entire executive leadership team, who are committed above all else to improving the lives of vulnerable children. So, how many of you have heard of Truth and Reconciliation Commission process? It's hard to believe that even though there have been over 40 of those done all over the world, it has never been done at a national level here in the United States. And after Canada released the results of their Truth and Reconciliation process, and we had invested so much money in racial healing and racial equity, we really said, maybe this country is ready to do this now. Now, of course, you have to look back at all the tragedies that we'd seen that were made so visible by technology, all the police-involved shootings, and the survey data back in 2015, 2016, for the first time was saying that there was a growing consensus across races. The majority white population was recognizing that we needed to do something about racism in this country. And so we thought this is a moment where America could do a truth and reconciliation process, but that we would have to adapt it to our unique, diverse, and historic burden. And so that's what truth, racial healing, and transformation is about. It is an adaptation of the globally recognized truth and reconciliation experience for the United States. I grew up as an adult in Chicago. I like to think I grew up in Cleveland, but you don't really grow up until you become an adult and spend the first 20 years of your life learning what you should have learned. And in Chicago, they say, make no small plans. And so this truth, racial healing, and transformation effort, we've embraced that model. We've made no small plans on this one. So, and we invite you to become a part of it too. So I've answered that question, what is it? It's a community-based, but at the same time, it's a national partnership. Some of you may remember the Kerner Commission report that came out after the riots maybe not. Anybody in this room remember the Kerner Commission? President Lincoln, just you and I? That's amazing. Oh boy. Well, it's the most thorough, publicly funded analysis of racial dynamics in this country. And President Johnson ordered it after the riots of the 60s. There were over 150 cities exploded in riots that summer. Some people call them uprisings today, but they were riots. And so the Kerner Commission on Civil Disobedience brought all the leading social scientists and experts together because he wanted to know, why did this happen? And they tried to really keep the results from being made public because it very clearly said the problem was racism. And specifically, they laid the burden on lack of access to employment and police brutality. But that was in 1968. Here we are, how much later? A similar commission would give you similar results. But the one piece that this commission called for that no one paid attention to, they called for a multi-sectoral, collaborative effort to create the public will to address these issues. Now, we didn't know it when we designed the TRHT. We hadn't reviewed the Kerner Commission recently, but because we're coming up on a 50th anniversary, so now you'll hear about it. That's what the TRHT is designed to be, that multi-sectoral collaboration that will generate the public will to do what? To finally take the fallacy upon which this country was built, the fallacy of an ideology of a hierarchy of human value. This taxonomy, which we know we inherited, it's there in all of our systems, but most painfully, it's in the human family. This idea that how you look determines your value as a human being. This is a carryover from the 18th century. It is a graded hierarchy, a graded taxonomy from Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist, but we still live with that. And that idea is embedded in our systems. And what we've concluded after working very hard on this is that we can either continue to deal with the effects of that ideology, or we can confront, uproot, and jettison that ideology completely. And so the work of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort is to do just that. So we had to ask ourselves, and I really get distracted by slides, but I felt like coming to this academic setting, I had to have slides. So I'm going to try to do both. But listen to what I'm saying. Pay less attention to the slides. So we had to ask ourselves, How do you do that? How do you change consciousness in this country? How do you mobilize the public will to say that no, there is no false hierarchy. There is no hierarchy of the human family. We are all equal. Now, we have the aspirational language in our founding documents, but we juxtapose that with describing Africans as 3/5 of human beings. We juxtapose that by decimating and annihilating indigenous people. And so the aspirational piece of our founding documents, that all are created equal and endowed by their creator, that's the work that we have to get to. But we don't even acknowledge that we still have to do that work as a country. So we funded some research as we built up to this bodacious aspirational goal to create the TRHT. A lot of it was in the area of implicit and unconscious bias. And we're still funding that work, and the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State University produces an annual compendium that follows the science in that space. But we're learning that you can become aware of your own biases. You can put in place techniques, personal behavioral techniques, to help overcome those biases. Why is that so important at an individual level? It's important because we need more people in positions of power in this country to make decisions who reflect the true diversity of this country. And the absence of that is in some ways a reflection of our innate and embedded biases. It's important because when a police officer takes the life of a young man of color rapidly without thinking, when he shoots, or like in Chicago, when he shoots 16 times while the young man lays in the street, there's something operating cognitively that is a reflection of his deeply held beliefs. Does this make us bad people because we're biased? No, it makes us human. But part of our work is to recognize and overcome those biases. We asked ourselves, if we're going to get rid of this belief in a hierarchy of human value, if we're going to get rid of racism, how do we do it? So initially, we knew it had to be a broad-based collaborative effort. We reached out. We have over 100 organizations engaged. And these are not the choir. These are groups like Chambers of Commerce, the American Library Association, the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They've made a commitment to create a TRHT center in every university in the country eventually. The libraries are going to be important places where this work is done. We have private sector representatives. Collectively, this group of over 100 organizations has a reach of 200 million people. Once we had our coalition together, we set about a collaborative design process. And I know some of you are involved in collaborative research processes. And I thought I was aging well until I undertook this process. I looked in the mirror at the end of that year of working with these groups collaboratively, and I was like, oh my God, that's harder than raising 2 kids as a single parent. It was really rough. But they worked together, and we did it virtually, and we did it in person, and we ended up with this group of people, over about 120 folks, putting together a set of recommendations for how we work to implement the TRHT within a specific framework. Now, the framework is what I want to share with you, because it dovetails with the social determinants. It dovetails with the life course perspective. I think you're going to see opportunities for the epigenetic conversation to be embedded. We first asked ourselves, how do we hold on to this crazy idea of a human hierarchy? And it's through the stories that we tell and the stories that we believe. So the first piece of the framework is what we call narrative change. How do we begin to tell different stories? How do you say to those 600 families who are preparing the food that we eat at such a sacrifice as to be disproportionately burdened, not only with environmental toxins, but social stressors? How do you tell that story in a way that gives agency and power and garners respect and value for those families that we heard about this morning? How do you tell the true story of our history from multiple perspectives that honors not just the unspeakable atrocities of racism, but the amazing resilience, the miraculous perseverance, the spiritual strength, the camaraderie that has been evidenced across racial lines? How do we create a story of America that truly reflects who we've been and who we could become? And that's narrative change. We have over 40 people working with us on that, from the entertainment industry and journalism and all sorts of groups that are involved in creating our narrative. The science behind the power of narrative, the neuroscience, how narrative becomes our reality and how it shapes our behaviors, we need more research in that space. The second area that we've done in the framework is called racial healing and relationship building, trust building. You talked about, one of the speakers this morning talked about how social relationships and nurturance helps to reduce the biomarkers of an elevated allostatic load. Many of our practitioners, we have over 100, create what we call racial healing circles. And we know that those circles, actually in the experience of being in those circles and building authentic relationships, helps to increase oxytocin levels. We need more research that shows how short-term and long-term engagement with deliberate and intentional social interaction, how that affects the long-term and the short-term allostatic load and stress responses. We have to overcome this idea of being totally separate from one another. So right now we have 12 communities that we're funding, and we have over 80 other foundations that have gotten involved with this work. And those 12 communities will be doing that community engagement that they brought multi-sector teams together to commit to this work over time. So we're very excited about it. And one community in California is Los Angeles. So anybody here from Los Angeles? No. But you can connect with that work. The only state level engagement we have is Michigan. But I would love for California to be engaged at a state level. I think it would do wonders for this country on so many different levels. But once we had the narrative change focus clearly and a set of recommendations, and we had the racial healing focus clearly there, the other reason we talk about racial healing is that the harm that comes from a lifetime of exposure to discrimination and to all of these social determinants of pathology and illness, we need a country that acknowledges that. We need a language. We need it in our textbooks. We need it in our board exams for becoming physicians. We need methodologies that acknowledge the harm that comes from this, and also we need to offer not just treatment for the pathologies, but we need to offer interventions to mitigate the effects of an absence of control and the sense of being rejected or not belonging. It's a fundamental human need to belong. And when we continue to be exposed to dynamics that say we don't, it affects our biochemistry and our physiology. We need, perhaps most importantly, research that talks about how we mitigate these exposures on a day-to-day basis. Nutrition is critically important. And yet the people who experience most of the exposure to this ideology have the least access to healthy food, affordable healthy food. That's a big area that we need work. So 2 pieces of the framework, the narrative change and the racial healing. But then we stepped back and we had a team of 40 working on narrative change, a team of about 40 working on the racial healing specifics. Then we moved into, so how has this ideology of a hierarchy of human value been sustained for centuries in this country. We needed a way to simplify our approach to that. I was at the Council on Foundations meeting in Dallas, Texas yesterday, and we were having this discussion, and one of the presidents of the foundation said, it's not that we don't believe racism is important, we just think it's too big for us to deal with it. So you do have to break it down into chunks that you can deal with. So we know narrative change is critical. We know that if we started to be bombarded with different images and different stories that celebrate our common humanity, we would see a change. We know that if we begin to build authentic relationships across racial lines, we begin to heal. We also provide resources that support. We know that'll help. But in the end, it's structural. It's not individual alone. It's structural. And so we came up with 3 basic pieces that we focused our work around. The first is we maintain this ideology of a hierarchy of human value by keeping us separate. America is still a very segregated country, and you heard some of that this morning. Separation, isolation, and colonization, exploitation, they're all there. That's a big piece of how we keep this in play. So people worked on that, our Native American, our African American, solid recommendations on how we deal with this. We don't have a housing policy in this country that even considers the issue of racialized housing and segregation. We need that. The second big area of intervention was the legal system. We have institutionalized this hierarchy of human value through our legal system, not just our criminal system that we've been exposed to, but also our civil, as well as the policies that come from that. Now, you talk about hard work. We had over 30 attorneys in this group, but they came up with some amazing recommendations for what needs to happen legally. The policies, the zoning policies, the tax policies, the banking policies. There's so much that needs to be done to transform this hierarchical system that we've created. And then finally, ultimately, all of the systems, whether they were the immigration, the failure to have a just immigration policy, or centuries of enslavement, or the land acquisition, all of these things ultimately served an economic purpose. And so the third big bucket for this work is the economy. And the recommendations on the economic side were so bold that our foundation was like, wait a minute, we can't say that. What, are you kidding? We can't say that. So it went out to our lawyers to review, and I kept saying, but it's not us, we're not saying it, it's this team of people. It's 120 people representing this multi-sectoral partnership. So on that particular document, we have lots of caveats, saying, but the recommendations are there. So this work, truth, racial healing, and transformation, what do we want to transform? We want to transform the very systems, and but we can't get there without acknowledging what we've created. I believe that this idea that human beings are not descendants of a common human family, this idea that there are actual races, which is, there's no biological or scientific basis for that concept. It's a social concept. But we built this country on that concept. And that's the piece of the work we haven't done. We have not said we have to throw that out and we have to start fresh. And the Human Genome Project has given us that, the science that undergirds it. There is more difference within the so-called races than there is between the races. We are 99.9% the same. And so I'm asking you as scientists and professors to understand that the water we swim in, the environment that poses the greatest risk to our nation's children, most of whom are children of color. The majority, over 60% of Native American, African American, and Latino children today live in low-income or impoverished communities. So this is not a mandate that is for those people. This is the mandate for the future viability of our country. We can't have 60% of our children growing up in a country that denies their value as human beings. And so there's an urgency to do this work. It was urgent before the election. And now it's beyond urgent. It's just absolutely necessary. There was a study that came out a few weeks ago. It was published in The Nation. It was a California researcher and someone at Demos. It's not this particular slide, but it talked about and analyzed survey data as to why people voted the way that they did and why we had the election outcome that we did. And you know how it's been framed as economic dislocation and people were upset that they weren't? No. The highest indicator is fear of diversity. Fear that our country is becoming more diverse and what that will mean for and to them. We know that that fear was exploited and leveraged. And so again, the urgency of getting us to stop being afraid of one another and learn to see and value one another as human beings. That's what this work is about. Now, I want to digress a little bit now and talk about some of the programs that we are supporting, that we have funded to help mitigate and give agency. I think the research is wonderful, but honestly, too many research studies call for more research. We need action. Communities need agency. They need tools, they need answers, they need solutions. And so this work on changing our food system so that communities have access to healthy, fresh food, there is no question, and I hope one of the speakers today will talk about what we know about nutrition to help mitigate the effects of exposure to stress and reduce the allostatic load. We're the only foundation that has made a national initiative of funding breastfeeding and optimizing breastfeeding rates in this country. We need research to document the multiple levels of impact that breastfeeding has throughout the life course. In terms of birth outcomes, we need work to tell these mothers what they can do personally, individually, what communities can do to mitigate the effects of chemical exposure and discrimination and all these other things before and during pregnancy. We funded work, some of you may know of the centering pregnancy model, where we found that social support and group support helps to reduce the stress of pregnancy, decrease low birth weight outcomes, and increase positive pregnancy outcomes. We need interventions that help to mitigate the effects of stress now, not 20 years from now. We funded work with police departments around this country. There are over 50 police departments who have volunteered to be involved with psychologists to get in touch with their own biases and work to create environments that help to mitigate their unconscious actions on those biases. The area where we need the most work, I believe, is in the area of housing and transportation and employment opportunities. So I'm hoping that when you think about the social determinants of health framework, that you will begin to do more specific work, tell the stories, show how when we've intervened and we've provided more equitable opportunity in those critical areas, we actually do reduce the allostatic load and we actually do get better outcomes. You know about the lead issue. You know how children of color are disproportionately burdened by and exposed to lead. We have funding decisions that are being made in Washington right now in terms of affecting the environmental health programs that is simply unacceptable. I hope everybody in this room makes phone calls every day on behalf of the children. The final area where we need rapid intervention, and I don't know if any of you have read the book Weapons of Math Destruction. Anybody read that? This is a woman from the IT world who has identified the fact that the algorithms that are being used to drive the big data-based interventions, they carry the racial biases, and they are not attuned to the structural racism dynamics that we live with. And so we want to engage some of the leaders in the IT industry at a very different level, bring some of the most creativity to bear to figure out how do we take this age we're moving into of big data, and how do we get rid of the legacy of racial hierarchy that is embedded in those data systems, so that we are not 50 years from now having our lives be shaped by algorithms that are a carryover of the last 100 years. So that's an exciting part of the work that we still need to do, and I'm looking forward to doing that. Einstein was my hero, and if you haven't read this book, I strongly encourage you to read it, Einstein on Race and Racism. Now, of the over 100 monographs and biographies and articles that have been written about Einstein, none of them talked about his great stand against racism. They'd rather keep that invisible. But when you silence leaders like this who've made a stand against racism, you help to perpetuate it. And so I always talk about Einstein because there's no question that he was the genius of the 20th century. And if he got it, surely we can as we move into the 21st century. So I thank you for your attention, and I really thank you for your work, and I absolutely invite you to partner with us. We need you, and we need your efforts. Thank you.